Okay. All right. So my talk is about Plato's Republic, which I'm sure you've all heard of before. As you know, it's in dialogue format. So I'm going to make some introductory comments about dialogue and about the history of the problem that I'm trying to discuss and how that problem comes down to us, kind of through the generations of intellectual history. Because it's not so much a problem in Plato, but a problem about Plato that I'm trying to deal with. So, as you know, Plato writes dialogues. He doesn't necessarily write treatises like Aristotle. Aristotle is much more into, we think this follows from this. Plato has this character Socrates. Socrates says some things, but interlocutors also say some things. So trying to study Plato is part philosophy, but it's also part intellectual history because you have to take the words on the page and put them together into Plato's own thoughts. And then it's part literary analysis because you have to dissect the art form of the dialogue as well as the philosophical content. So because this has always been a problem, there's kind of a whole history of reading the Republic that I want to cover before I get into the actual topic. Now, Aristotle, for contrast, what survives of him is lecture notes, things we think he would have been saying in class, in a lecture, at the Lyceum. For Plato, no analogous piece of writing survives. So we don't know if Plato would have given lectures at the Academy that were specifically on the Republic as a piece of writing itself. And if he did give them, we don't know what the content of those lectures would have been. However, there is one other person in history, namely Aristotle, who we can be reasonably sure would have attended such a lecture if there had been one. Now, in the Politics, which is Aristotle's work on political theory, he refers to the Republic multiple times as the political doctrine which he is trying to refute. This seems to generate the impression that the Republic is the kind of work it's telling us it is, namely a political work. Sometimes, you have to be a little careful, because sometimes Aristotle will say, in the Republic Socrates argues, and sometimes he will say, in the Republic Plato argues. Now, I think it would be a very interesting project to actually go through the entire Politics and pick out which ones are which, but it's a little beyond the scope of what I'm doing today. All I'm trying to say for my purposes here is, we know that from the very beginning in antiquity, we have scholars referring to the Republic as expressing Plato's doctrines and as expressing political doctrines. Now, it's true there are other political dialogues that Plato wrote, such as the Laws and the Statesman, and in antiquity these were often taken more seriously than the Republic, specifically as blueprints or as guidelines for actual political action. The Laws is much more about building a state or building a city in reality, whereas the Republic focuses on building the city in speech. And the Statesman is a detailed account of who the ruler is and how the ruler has to work with human nature as we find it. And the Republic is quite a bit more pie in the sky. It's much more difficult to distill or to take out a real practical political program from the Republic. So, and thinkers in antiquity knew this. On the other hand, it's not as though the Republic was completely discounted. We know that thinkers, specifically Cicero, seem to have been influenced by things that were written in the Republic. So the very early picture of how the Republic was interpreted is kind of fuzzy, but we do at least know some of these basic points, that it is political, that people do read it. Now, as the story goes on, I'm sure you'll recognize parts of it. Just bear with me until we get to the end. As I'm sure you all know, the Roman Empire collapses, intellectual life declines in the Western world. Platonism as an epistemological and metaphysical and to some extent ethical doctrine is kept alive in the Latin West in thinkers like Augustine, Boethius, John Scotus, but the political doctrines are more or less lost. Political order begins to collapse. However, pagan philosophy still continues to be respected in the Byzantine Empire. This is facilitated by the fact that Greek is the native language, so it's not as hard to get the words, to the intellectuals in the culture. Also, the academy continues to run until the 5th century. Justinian closes it down after that point, but you know, the kind of philosophical education is still being given to students in the Latin East long beyond the fall of what we know to be the Roman Empire. An interesting point at this point is the Republic seems to have been at least partially influential in the formation of an Eastern Orthodox teaching known as Caesaropapism. You can see the two root words there, Caesar and papism. This doctrine, which was popular at the time of the Byzantine Empire, was that the church and state form an organic unity, that political power and secular power and religious power and ethical power are one thing. And the Republic very much, well, at least to some extent, seems to have concurred with this and may have partially informed this. Now, in the later on, Constantinople falls to Muslim invaders, and Plato is translated into Arabic. Averroes takes it upon himself to produce a commentary of every Aristotelian work that survives. He could not get his hands on a copy of the Politics. What work did he use in its place? He used the Republic. When Aristotle's political work was unavailable to Averroes, he used the Republic instead as an example of ancient Greek political thought. As a kind of side note, this also comes to influence Muslim ideas of religion and state being unified. Certain other later events in history, like the Crusades, reopened cultural exchange between the Middle East and Western Europe. Greek philosophy is rediscovered. Philosophy, the Republic specifically, comes back into the West, where Renaissance humanists see it as an ideal utopian fantasy. Thomas More specifically makes multiple allusions to Plato's Republic in his own work, Utopia. The kind of fictional traveler who gives his account of going to see Utopia is also stated as having been a lover of Plato's dialogues. Now, with Thomas More, I've already gestured towards these works entering into the English-speaking world, which I primarily want to focus on for the purposes of this talk. Now, the Republic in the English-speaking world, as it begins to be translated, comes to be the foremost, the real centerpiece of the study of ancient philosophy. The first English translation is done in 1804 by Thomas Taylor. At that point, it's still being used more for its metaphysics and epistemology. It influenced Romantic literature, but didn't really make its way into more serious philosophical thought until 1865, when George Grote writes a commentary on Plato. Even that really kind of steers away from the political issue. But in 1871, Benjamin Jowett produces this classic translation of the Republic. Benjamin Jowett is an idealist philosopher, and the interpretation which his translations, commentaries, pieces of scholarship on the Republic really came to form the place that the dialogue holds in scholarship, through the 19th and even into the early 20th century. You'll notice the subtitle of his translation, Plato's classic work on the ideal commonwealth. So we're still looking at a primarily political interpretation of the Republic. Now, interestingly enough, Jowett's translation of the Republic coincides with a time in Western history where many of the issues that Plato is talking about are very, very relevant to what's happening in contemporary history at the time. So, you have the 18th century, you have the rise of industrialism, an expanding democratic franchise, the lessening of the power of the aristocracy in Britain, and a lot of these kinds of issues caused the Republic to really come to the fore as a work to grapple with philosophically, to think about very important political questions. If you're a wealthy elite in Britain who thinks that pure democracy of the kind that seems to be coming into rise in 19th century Britain is a chaotic, disorganized regime, Plato has a lot to say to you